record. And today we have Dr. Jeremy Hoffman's lecture, The Enduring Legacy of Inequitable Exposure to Extreme Heat in U.S. Urban Areas. Dr. Hoffman is the Chief Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia, an affiliate faculty in the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs, and the Center for Environmental Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Hoffman has served as a member of the Environment Committee for the Museum Science and Industry in Chicago, a Science Communication Fellow for the Orkin Museum of Science and Industry, and the Mitchell-Hamline School of Law, and was recently honored as one of Style Weekly Richmond's Top 40 Under 40, and one of the Grist 50 Fixers for 2020. Dr. I'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Becca. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to medical professionals, students at this time. Let me start by saying I am in awe consistently of the health profession, as the son of a nurse who worked in a chemotherapy ward of an oncology office. I just have utmost respect for people that work in health and that dedicate their lives to taking care of other people. So what I'm going to share with you today focuses on extreme heat, and I'll do my best to explain things as we go along. If you have a question as I'm presenting, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll try and address it as it comes out. There will be a little bit of participation needed, so get ready to put some ideas into the chat in a second. And hopefully we'll emerge from this conversation with a better understanding of how climate change multiplies a threat that is already existing in many cities around the country. And there's a historical view to take about that inequity. This work wouldn't have been possible without my colleagues at Portland State University, Virginia Commonwealth University, and the University of Richmond. And I'm just excited to get to tell you a little bit more about it. So I have to announce that I don't have any external industry relationships, and I don't have any sort of financial, conflicts of interest. So yeah, so that's that slide. I don't know quite what to say when we get to that, but let me tell you a little bit about heat. Stuff that I do know how to talk about. What we're looking at is several bar charts in a row, and up on these graphs is always generally going to be some sort of increasing value of something. And then across the bottom is almost always going to be time with the present or the nearest time period on the farthest right. Each bar here gets progressively bigger. Now, what do those bars mean? This is a paper from 2015 that was analyzing the details about extreme heat in the 50 largest cities in America. As far as the number of heat waves per year, which is what this graph is showing, there's been a steady increase in the number of extreme heat waves occurring in the 50 largest cities in the US. Not only are they getting more frequent, but they're actually getting longer in general. So the number of days as part of that heat wave has also increased over the last 50 so years. So too, then you might imagine that it's not only what type of heat wave or how long it is or how frequent they are, but actually how intense it is. How hot does it get? And it turns out that those are getting more intense as the climate starts to shift towards more common extremes in the heat world. And then finally, not only are they more common, longer, and more intense, but they're happening at weirder times of the year. So we're having heat waves experienced earlier in the spring, before the onset of really like summer, and then they can even persist and occur late into the fall when we're actually all starting to enjoy, pumpkin spiced lattes and sweater vests and all those sorts of things. I'm not sure what the style is these days down at Emory or at other institutions, but the heat wave season is pushing outward into the shoulder seasons, spring and fall. So this kind of frames a really interesting problem, because if they're already getting more intense, longer, and happening at weirder times of the year, climate change presents a whole new threat in that by the mid-century, depending on the emissions trajectory that we take over the next few decades, we could see about 20 to 30 more days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit here locally to me in Richmond, Virginia. But down in Georgia, we could be seeing, upwards of 2 months more days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit than usual. That is not particularly fun for me to imagine, because I'm a person that very much enjoys getting outside, bicycling, mountain biking, those sorts of things. And I sweat a lot. So having more days when I'm going to be soaked in sweat does not particularly sound like a good situation for me personally. Why is heat important to our health? Well, it might come as a surprise to you, but the average number of people killed per year by weather is actually the number one leading cause of weather-related fatalities is extreme heat, more so than flooding and tornadoes combined on average. But what's surprising is that we generally don't hear about extreme heat on the news. We do hear about extreme floods. Here today, we have the opportunity of getting maybe close to 2 or 3 inches of rainfall in Richmond, and flooding will become something that'll be all over the news. We have heard a little bit more about extreme heat in recent years as the public and the news reporters have become a little bit more attuned to that reality. Kind of the classic example of human mortality in the face of extreme heat comes from the city of Chicago in 1995. So we're looking here at the month of July, 1995. The black line represents the actual observed temperatures. So you can see since starting about the 11th of July, temperatures got over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and then basically stayed above 90, 95 degrees Fahrenheit for about 4 or 5 days. That black line is followed by this red spike, and that's unfortunately mortality associated with the heat wave. You can see there was a couple days of lag time between the onset of the heat wave and when people started suffering and succumbing to extreme heat, and that is for a number of reasons. But by and large, depending on who you ask, there's somewhere around 650 to 900 excess deaths attributed to this heat wave. And partially that's because of where people lived. So this was the first time that we got a good idea that people living in the same city might be experiencing very different conditions during these extreme heat waves. By and large, in the city of Chicago, these areas that suffered increased mortality were largely elderly communities of color, people who were afraid to leave their houses or to open their windows to achieve some sort of ventilation of their living space. That also helps to understand this kind of lagged response to the temperature, people kind of languishing in this heat for many days. And I bring this story up and this picture in particular because I remember this in the Chicago Tribune. I was growing up in the city of Chicago at this time in the 1990s. And my family, being a privileged middle-class white family in the suburbs, was actually having a yard party with baby pools and air conditioning and cold drinks, and we didn't suffer at all at this time. But at the exact same moment, across town, 15 miles away, there were people suffering and dying in this extreme heat wave. So it speaks to me at a personal level to understand more about what drives vulnerability to extreme heat, and why do these particular neighborhoods continually show up as areas that experience higher than normal mortality and even just morbidity in the face of extreme heat. So let's bring it to Virginia. I know most of you are in Georgia, but I've been working with the Virginia Department of Health to understand this extreme heat burden a little bit more locally. And so up on this graph is more people getting sick for heat-related illnesses. This is using the CSTE heat-related illness coding in ICD-9 and 10 codes. And it's expressed as a percentage of all visits to the hospital. So, up is more relatively people getting sick for heat-related illness. And then along the bottom here on the x-axis is temperature. Instead of time, we're just looking at the extremes in temperature from about 60 degrees apparent temperature to 120. far right, we barely, if ever, will get to 120 degrees apparent temperature. The highest of all temperatures in Richmond is, in the low hundreds. And so what we can do is kind of figure out what this curve might look like. And so start thinking in your head what you think this might look like. If you've worked with temperature and morbidity data before, you might be thinking something that looks like a straight line, like as temperature goes up, people are getting sick, and it's like an incremental increase in both. Or maybe you're thinking it's a flat line and there's no real, ideally there's no sort of, because heat-related illnesses are entirely preventable, this would be the ideal condition where nobody is suffering heat-related illnesses, even at the highest temperatures. But then there's what actually happens is it turns out to be a dog leg shape or an exponential curve. We've been experiencing an exponential curve in many places around the country and around the world, and with COVID-19, in that an incremental increase in temperature is actually accelerating the number of people that get sick as it gets hotter. So above about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, those days that are going to become much more common in the future, we see an acceleration in the number of people getting sick due to extreme heat. This is funny, it's not funny at all, but it's interesting in the sense that in North Carolina, there seems to be a downturn over about 102 degrees Fahrenheit, where people are generally seemingly like not going outside at all. And so this relationship actually kind of relaxes over at the more extreme ends. We don't seem in Virginia to have gotten the memo, and so we just have an increasing amount of people. This is data over the last 5 years as well, so it covers a pretty good amount of time. Why is this, I had mentioned before that extreme heat rarely makes it into the headlines, but locally here in Virginia, we've started to take notice. And in July 2019, last summer, there were headlines about over 1,000 people that had sought out emergency care for heat-related illnesses. Just in 1 month, 1,000 people. It's a pretty amazing burden when you start to think about it. But we can actually dive down even further into the data and explore a little bit about when these illnesses occur the most. So what I'm showing you data of ambulance responses. So this is actual emergency services being dispatched and arriving at a place where where a heat-related illness is occurring. And then each bar color is a different year, and each month through the summer. So from May to September. And then up is more heat-related illness responses. You might start to think to yourself, well, what does this graph maybe look like? Knowing that temperatures tend to increase until July and then cool throughout the rest of the summer, this shape might not be surprising, in that the lowest numbers of heat-related illness responses for the ambulance occur in May and September, and the primary burden tends to be in July. July is also our warmest month here in Richmond, and interestingly, you might notice these two spikes, the gray and orange bars here. It turns out that those are related to extremely warm conditions in June 2015 and August 2016 were some of our warmest Junes and Augusts on record. So we seem to have a very tight relationship between temperature and heat-related illness responses. So with July being the primary burden. Now, what's also interesting to look at is what time of day these occur. So we can look at them by month. Unsurprisingly, the hottest time of the year, we have the most heat-related illnesses. But what about during the day? If you think to yourself, what time would be when most heat-related illnesses occur, I would love to see, what you're all thinking in your head about what this graph looks like. So along the bottom, we have time after midnight going throughout the day. And then up again is the number of heat-related illnesses. And perhaps unsurprisingly as well, the number of heat-related illnesses follow kind of a diurnal cycle, much like our temperatures, with the primary burden occurring sometime between 2 and 4 p.m., which is the hottest time of the day, at least in the summer. And This little spike here is during the lunch hour and may be related to things like construction workers and people that are outside even during these time periods. It's also when people tend to be maybe walking between places, or who really knows? We don't know entirely what's driving this one little spike, but the kind of hump shape of this, with the primary burden being in the middle of the afternoon, is important for understanding the long-term impacts of urban design on extreme heat. Which brings me to when I need your help, everybody. If we were in person, I love doing this as a call and response, but instead we're going to do it in the chat. So we know that the extreme heat doesn't impact every place the same. And largely that has to do with the human design of urban spaces. So in the chat room, I want you to write down on 3, all at the same time, just so you get ready to type. On 3, you're going to write where the hottest spot to the touch in this picture is. We're going to fly into this picture like on the Magic School Bus. Where is going to be the hottest spot to the touch? On 3, write it in the chat, okay? 1, 2, 3, write it in the chat. Write it in the chat, write it in the chat, write it in the chat. Ooh, look at all these responses. Nice, nice. Okay, we see a lot of parking, pavement, cars, parking lot. Okay, everybody, it's good, good, good. Keep those ideas coming. Now on 3, get ready to type, get ready to type. Where is the coolest spot to the touch? On 3, the coolest spot. 1, 2, 3. Nice, nice, nice. Yeah, so what I love about this exercise in forming this hypothesis about where these hotspots are is that we actually have more answers disagreeing about where the hottest spot is, but we almost have no disagreement about where the coolest spot is. It's almost like an evolutionary biology thing for humans to know that where to go on a hot day is under the tree and go to the shade. And so that, anyway, it seems like an easy observation, but what we had was a bunch of different answers for what the hottest surface is. And so what we can use are really cheap, in many ways, sensors, thermal sensors that you can use on your smartphone. I use one by a company called FLIR. And so we can actually take a picture of this exact same landscape and test your hypotheses. And so I'm going to reveal what the temperatures look like. The hotter temperatures are brighter colors and the cooler temperatures are darker colors. Might not surprise you to find out that the parking lot is by far the hottest surface. Now, these are very dense, especially right in the hottest spot is kind of right in here. It's like this gummy asphalt, very thick, dark, has a very high heat capacity. Then the coolest spot is, unsurprisingly, underneath this big mature oak tree. It's about 87 degrees Fahrenheit underneath that tree on the grass. And on the hottest spot here on the asphalt, it's about 175 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you could cook an egg on that, basically on the asphalt on the hottest days. But what I think is more interesting is the in-between. Because if you start looking really closely at this photo, you can start to see some really amazing patterns emerging. Namely that the non-native grasses here, these are non-native European grasses, are the same temperature as the sidewalk. It turns out that these plants have very shallow root systems that don't allow them to hold on to water very efficiently. So they dry out and become just like another sidewalk. On the other hand, across the parking lot here, we have this native plant garden that's all Virginia native plants. And because of their very deep root systems, they're able to tap into water that's very far below the surface, allowing them to remain cool, at least to the sensor's eye, throughout the season. So that tells you a little bit about maybe the type of plants that we could use to keep our landscapes a little bit cooler. And then what I find to be something that is kind of mesmerizing about this image is the difference between the various car colors. I'm struggling here to get this pointer off. So I want to go backwards. And so you see all the white van and the red car here and these dark colors all mixed in together. And you can see how that has a huge impact then on the temperatures that are coming back to the thermal sensor. Then there's like, I could basically teach an entire course using just this one photo about how urban design can either amplify or dampen extreme heat. So think about Atlanta in your head. If you're gonna like zoom out of this picture and be like above, like in Google Maps, you know, you can zoom out and be above the city of Atlanta and think to yourself, or your own city, wherever you may be, and think about if you were going to design a city or find the coolest spots in a city, what are the sorts of things that you're gonna be looking for? And how has a city been designed instead, or many neighborhoods in our cities been designed to either amplify or dampen heat? And so this is when we start to zoom out even further and take a look at a thermal sensor that's on a satellite that's flying through space called the Landsat satellite, and start to compare urban areas around the country to their nearby rural areas outside, we discover that urban heat islands are pretty much ubiquitous across the built environment. They've been studied now for, the phenomena was discovered a long time ago, and most of the research over the last like 40 or so years has really illuminated the fact that it's because of human landscapes changing the balance of the energy balance with natural landscapes that absorbs more of the sun's energy throughout the day and then re-radiates it back into the air throughout the afternoon and into the evening, elevating urban temperatures above rural temperatures. And you might imagine then within the same city, which is a lot of what our research has been showing, is that there's very much a lot of variation even within the same city that relates back to as much or more variation than the outside, the rural urban difference. And so this is the work of my colleague Vivek Chandas, who I've been very fortunate to be able to work with over the last several years, developing a method for analyzing intra-urban temperatures. And so you see here this little like tube that's sticking out of a passenger side window. And I've been calling this the car flag of science, because it kind of looks like the things that people would use to show their support for something like a sports team, maybe the Atlanta Falcons or the Washington Redskins, a lot of people here in Richmond do. But instead of showing their support for a team, this is showing your support for science. And so Vivek is showing how it's affixed to the window. What this is doing is analyzing little tiny, basically up in the white tap here, in the very top, air flows through this little system, and it triggers a thermocouple wire to send electrical signals down to a data logger that's keeping track of the temperature every single second. At the same time, there's a GPS unit on this that tells you where you are in space every single second. So by lining up the temperature measurements with the place measurements, we can get very detailed descriptions of how temperatures vary across very small geographical areas. And if you imagine, if we send out a bunch of cars all at the same time, and including people riding bikes and using other forms of transportation, we can start to get a really good snapshot view of what temperatures look like across an urban environment all at once. And if we choose the hottest day of the year, and we know using the weather forecast, you know, we can pretty much dispatch a team of people in a city to measure the city's temperature during a heat wave when those temperature differences might be at their maximum very effectively. And so we've reported this information in a couple different publications over the last couple of years, including one that shows our results for a couple cities, including Richmond in 2019. And so we did our campaign, this Urban Heat Island campaign, back in 2017. And I just want to show you a little bit about who made up our team. We had support from NOAA and the Virginia Academy of Science, as well as the city of Richmond. So many of you might be familiar with climate action plans or sustainability plans for cities. The city of Richmond is undergoing a transformation in this space right now with the leadership of Alicia Zakoff and Brianne Bullen at the Sustainability Office. There's the program called RVA Green 2050, and I implore you to go check this out, because Brianne and Alicia, along with some input from me and several other of our colleagues, have built what is now known as the Richmond Climate Equity Index. And so it explores 39 different variables related to underlying vulnerability to extremes brought on by climate change, not just heat, but also flooding and sea level change. And it's easily, industry leader, state-of-the-art understanding of where climate inequity exists in the city of Richmond. Also, I want to tell you quickly about a group called Groundwork RBA, which is a teen workforce skills development nonprofit from the north side of the city of Richmond. And Giles Harnsberger and Kendra Norell were working for them when we collaborated on this Heat Island campaign. And now Melissa Guevara and Rob Jones are at the helm there. And the purpose of Groundwork RBA is it's actually part of a national network of groundwork organizations with the mission to green Richmond, so improve the green infrastructure of the city, prepare youth for success, improve health and quality of life across all people that live in Richmond, and to realize racial equity. In a city like Richmond, which is the former capital of the Confederacy, you can imagine that there's a lot of energy around fixing these long-term inequities brought on by a history of structural racism in many forms across, that's clear in many data from Virginia's Commonwealth University's health system. What they were able to show actually was that people living just a few miles away from each other have as much as like a 20-year difference in their life expectancy in the city of Richmond. So this nonprofit has a very clear mission that's aligned with climate action that I think is really special. And their collaboration continues today with a project that we call Throwing Shade in RVA, which please Google that if you want to learn more about it. I won't get to talk about it today. This is a picture from our campaign in 2017. This appeared in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. This is Ajana James. She was a teenager at the time and was a junior or a sophomore at Open High School. Now she's majoring in environmental studies in college, which is really, really cool to have participated in this and then become an environmental steward herself. And so this is her affixing that car flag of science. And so we had 15 different cars driving around the city of Richmond. I rode my bike. We had another bike person going around on some of the trails and pedestrian walkways and stuff around the city. And we were able to discover a 16-degree Fahrenheit difference between the coolest and warmest place during a heat wave at the same time. At 3 p.m., that same time period where most people are getting sick due to heat-related illnesses and the ambulances responding to those emergencies, that's when we have the largest difference in temperature. So going back to the ambulance, we were actually able to get them to make a map for us of where they go the most. Not only were we able to analyze the months that they go and the times during the day, but actually in space, where do they go the most for heat-related illnesses? And it might not surprise you that these two maps look almost identical in that hotspots in the city are also hotspots of heat-related illnesses. This remains, this relationship between hotspots and heat-related illness hotspots even holds true when you look at the zip code level data that we're able to assess. So here's the Heat Island data expressed in zip codes. So the colors represent the coolest, middle, and hottest tercile, or just splitting the groups into three. And you can see this kind of dog leg shape of the hottest zip codes. Well, when we look at ambulance responses, it's not a trick to your eye that it does look the same, because the same four hottest zip codes are those with the highest ambulance response rates over the last 5 years, as well as the highest rates of urgent care and emergency department visits for heat-related illnesses. So not only is it the ambulance showing up, but it's actually people that might be going to the hospital otherwise that are also from the same 4 zip codes. So even correcting for things like, population density and all the ways that we can look at these data, it really does appear that the hottest areas of our cities of Richmond is experiencing the highest burden of heat. Now, this is a little bit more of a complicated figure. It's a correlation matrix where I've expressed the relationships as bubbles, colored bubbles. And the bigger the bubble, the stronger the relationship. So how tightly related are these two variables? Are they really, is it like a shotgun blast? That'd be a very small or non-existent circle versus a big circle. That means they're very tightly related. And also the color of the bubble relates to the style of relationship. And by that, I mean, do these two variables go up in the same direction? or in a negative relationship, while one is going up, does the other go down? So you can have a very strong negative relationship, whereas one is getting higher, the other one is going down. Or you can have a very strong positive relationship, like they both are going up at the same time. I belabor that point because this is a very important conclusion of the heat island data. When we look at the census data related to things like, do you own your home? Do you drive to work? Do you live alone? Are you taking public transportation? Or what kind of neighborhood is it really? We discover that at 3 p.m., hotter neighborhoods tend to be higher populations of communities of color, living in poverty with vacant properties. That reminds us of the echoes of Chicago in 1995. Many times also these people are taking public or alternative transportation to get to work. So even in their own neighborhood, they have to expose themselves to the extreme heat to get to work and to commute, which is interesting. They might be actually getting some of that dosage throughout the day, just needing to get to work. And then they have, by and large, lower educational attainment, lower tree canopy. That actually tends to be the strongest relationship. And they tend to have older houses. On the flip side, the cooler neighborhoods at 3 p.m. tend to be predominantly white neighborhoods with very low rates of poverty. They tend to be more occupied and maybe a more of a neighborhood, like a totally consistent neighborhood style. They tend to have their own car, so they might not ever really need to even go outside. They can go from a air-conditioned space in their house into their air-conditioned car to go to their air-conditioned workplace. They tend to have very much more canopy. This isn't surprising. Many other cities have shown that canopy varies based on income. And that's actually not a new observation, but very much related back to the temperature here in Richmond. And it tends to be relatively older people. So what does that look like in space? So this is neighborhoods broken up, not by actual neighborhood, but by block group, census block group. And so the colors here correspond to a denser urban canopy. And so you can see even just across, you could walk straight across the city of Richmond and experience canopies as high as 80%. To very much close to 0% with no trees. In the same city, there's a huge variation in the availability of this tree canopy. Those same areas that have very low tree canopy tend to be much more impervious surfaces. So a flip side of this map is just the darker colors in those areas that don't have a lot of tree canopy. I just saw something pop up. Does the ambulance frequency patterns differ during months when the temperature is moderate? That's a good question. Does the ambulance frequency patterns differ during months when the temperature is moderate? Yeah, so that's a really good question, Wayne. Since we're interested in looking at the temperatures and extreme heat burden, we didn't investigate kind of like extreme heat-related illnesses during, say, like the April or February or March. So I don't know the answer to that question. It would be really unlikely to see a lot of heat-related illnesses occurring outside of the heat season, either through they don't happen or they're miscategorized. So that's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you. So you might also, because of that previous graph of the relationships between these variables, is that so too then in the same way, walking across the city, you can go from a very tree canopied to a non-canopied neighborhood. So too in urban poverty is the case. So a lot of these areas with very low tree canopy tend to be also very high poverty. And so I call this map the color of money map, where the darker greens are richer and more wealthy neighborhoods. And so when we kind of put all these information together, the temperature, the canopy, the impervious surfaces, and the poverty, we arrive at a heat vulnerability map for the city of Richmond. And this goes into that RVA Green 2050 Climate Equity Index map that I told you about. And when we started to investigate this back in 2017 a little bit closer, a couple of my colleagues, I already went through this. A couple of my colleagues identified that this map of vulnerability looks a lot like an existing map from the 30s known as the Richmond redlining map. And so I've outlined in yellow where those two maps kind of overlay. And if you just look at the colors, these redder areas in the redlining map tend to be those areas that we identified as more heat vulnerable. And so it's worth it to explain a little bit about the redlining map and the redlining maps in general. It turns out that in the 30s, the federal government allowed for the Homeowners Loan Corporation to send out assessors into neighborhoods in 239 different cities around the country, or 239 towns of population of 40,000 and above. And basically what they did is to rate individual neighborhoods along a spectrum of perceived safety for investment, from very good and strong desirable neighborhoods, which is A, or the green areas, to what was termed hazardous or fourth grade in the red areas. This actually then resulted in denial of home loans, security, and all like financial opportunity in these redlined areas for many decades. And that was what it was supposed to do, but it actually turns out that the redlined areas were predominantly communities of color and newly settled ethnic areas, and generally just just anyone that wasn't kind of like a like native white population of American cities were given these red designations. So in Richmond, many of these, in fact, every single one of the red line neighborhoods was a historically community of color, and was given no description beyond the fact that it was 100% Negro. Whereas the green line neighborhoods in the city of Richmond were given these long and flowery descriptions about their topography and the families that lived there and their occupations, and very detailed information about these neighborhoods. So it's very clear that these HOLC maps were really the product of structural racism more so than something along the lines of safety for investment. And so we started to look at just the temperatures across these neighborhoods. And so along here is these A-rated neighborhoods are the green areas, and the D-rated neighborhoods are the formerly redlined places. And so we're looking at their temperatures. They actually significantly increase by grade. And so this observation led to an improved hypothesis. Was basically, we want to test that there's no difference between these grades at the national level. And just to give you an idea of where these maps occur, there were not many cities that were above 40,000 people at this time of the country's history in the West, but you can see a very large dispersal of the Southeast, Northeast, and Midwest, and a few big cities on the West Coast. And so part of this was really informed by other studies which had been coming out that showed other sorts of relationships between redlining areas. So up on this graph is actually house value, and then across the bottom is time. The house values in formerly redlined areas have consistently lagged behind every other grade, and it overlap with these definitely declining or C-graded areas. Also, these neighborhoods tend to remain low to moderate income areas. So this report from the NCRC showed that they tend to be lower income areas, as well as being predominantly communities of color. So looking at nationally, it seems to be a echo of what's going on just in our own backyard here in Richmond. And so another interesting observation from several cities that had gotten these redlining maps before was that they're actually starting to experience disproportionately high rates of gentrification in these formerly redlined areas. So really, it's kind of a double whammy of trauma in some ways, in that these areas were disinvested in for generations, and then now these people are being displaced by new development as our cities go through transformation and densification. And so anyway, I want to share with you just quickly, we went through each city and took their HOLC map. So here's Richmond up here, and we took a satellite image using their thermal sensor on the Landsat. So basically using thermal information from a satellite, the HOLC map, we then took each average temperature across those individual areas in each city, and then did statistical tests between the different neighborhoods. And so here's the results for Richmond on the right. And then we looked at the underlying land use, so the tree canopy and the impervious surfaces. So unsurprisingly, here's Richmond. I showed you this before in a different way, that tree canopy is severely limited in these formerly redlined areas versus the formerly green-lined areas. And instead of tree canopy, there's more impervious surfaces. So we did this for every city, 108 different cities across the city or across the country. We took many of those 239 maps and then considered them all part of one city. So like in New York, for example, all of the different boroughs have their own map. And so we just consider that all part of New York City. And then like places like Boston have a bunch of smaller communities that are part of that Boston regional area. So that's why we went from 239 to 108, just to streamline the analysis. And perhaps unsurprisingly, based on this conversation, in 94% of the cities, there was a relationship where the D areas are warmer than the formerly rated A areas. So there is about a 4.5 degree Fahrenheit difference on average between these formerly redlined and non-redlined areas in the present day. This is also unique to each region of the United States. So the Midwest tends to have a little bit less of that difference, whereas the South and the West tend to have a more significant difference between the coolest and warmest places. Unsurprisingly, then, too, is that across the country, there's a more preponderance of impervious surfaces in these formerly redlined areas and a lack of tree canopy. This has now been reestablished in a couple of papers that have been published since January. Our paper came out in the early part of January, and a couple of papers have come out since to corroborate these findings, which is really assuring. And again, there's even more variation across these different regions of the United States in their long-term tree canopy availability and their impervious surface. And so we didn't do any more deep dive really into any individual city. And we're kind of like now allowing the research community to understand more about what does this mean. And so we have some hypotheses about heat-related illnesses, of course, and tried to determine the best method for assessing that. We do have some really encouraging results, not necessarily encouraging in the sense that it's a good thing, but that there are other comorbidity things that are going on as well. And so in this paper that came out in the Planetary Health by Anthony Nardone, just a couple weeks after our paper dropped, we're looking here again at the HOLC risk grade along the bottom, D and A. And then up on this is more a rate for visits to the emergency department for asthma in the 8 California cities that received redlining maps in the 30s. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there is the measurable and significant difference in the rates of asthma experienced in these formerly redlined communities in California. And this actually plays a role then in our understanding of things like the vulnerability to COVID-19, as that is a very severe respiratory issue, and asthma and respiratory predispositions are part of what makes people vulnerable. This is just kind of rolls all of this stuff together, that while I'm not saying that redlining created these disparities, it made them law. These cities and neighborhoods probably looked remotely like today, even back in the 30s, in their form and their impervious surface amounts and all of that sort of thing. But it did cut off investment in those areas versus the others. So we're seeing this now echo almost 100 years later in these acute health outcomes across states and across the country. And so really quick, I know we have to wrap up. I'm going to give a little bit of time for questions. But we don't have those data for the Mid-Atlantic, but we do know that communities of color tend to have higher exposure to air pollution that might give rise to these asthma-related illnesses as well in the Northeast and in the Mid-Atlantic. And so when we look at the breakdown of PM 2.5 exposure, which is particulate matter, is the stuff that gets into your lungs and can exacerbate respiratory issues, that throughout the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, that communities of color are disproportionately exposed to PM 2.5 from vehicle pollution. Many ways because these redlined areas were the pathway that many highways were bulldozed and built in the revitalization, urban revitalization, and white flight in the generations after redlining. So this is heavy, this idea that the historical context of these things are playing out as climate-related vulnerabilities and other vulnerabilities almost 100 years after is really quite amazing. And so what is the pathway forward? To me, it's working with the communities that live in these areas to use their voice and vision to create a more pervious kind of neighborhood where they're able to address not only air temperatures, but stormwater mitigation as well as air quality mitigation through green infrastructure and basically improving the environmental quality of their neighborhoods through community input and design. So I'm going to leave it on this slide and ask if you have any questions about what I just shared with you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that this gives a little bit of historical context to climate change vulnerability now and into the future.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. While Harrison is gathering our questions from our students, I want to really thank you for taking on this challenging and, like you said, this is heavy, this is upsetting legacy of structural racism and how that has influenced the built environment, the lack of tree canopy, lack of green space, and how that in turn is influencing health. And I'm sure that a lot of our students through this lecture this has probably elicited a sense of anger and injustice at the past, of which they are too young to have been involved, but have certainly witnessed in their life the results of it. And it's a pity that we're not all in the same room to be able to talk through more of those things. I'm sure some questions will come up, but I wanted to ask you from your position and where you sit, these are future doctors. What would you have us do, doctors and future doctors, from where we sit to help address this legacy?
Yeah, so I definitely think that, I don't want to ask too much of you because you're already asked to do so much, keeping us safe and keeping us healthy. But if, I think one thing that I find very reassuring is that, your ability to see the real impacts of these things and then report out about them and tell people about your experience and be able to be that mirror back to the community about what's going on and what's really happening. One of the most effective doctors, other than Sam Adut, who you'll hear from in a little bit, Janet Eddy is also a doctor here in the city of Richmond, and she worked with low-income, uninsured, predominantly English as second language communities in the city of Richmond, and she, is trying to be the voice for a voiceless community. I think that what many health professionals can do is to step, if they feel so compelled to serve in that kind of capacity. I also think that telling people about how their vulnerability might be going on, like to describe, a heat-related illness, allergies, air quality related as respiratory stuff, and how climate interacts with those things, just to elevate the public understanding that there truly are these climate related stressors that play out in our health, and that climate change is making them somewhat worse, depending on the city. Those are my two recommendations.
Thank you for that. And I will let Harrison ask the rest of the questions.
Oh, I can't hear you yet, Harrison.
Yeah, Harrison, it looks like you may be on mute through another means. Still can't hear you.
Let's see.
Now?
Yes,
yep,
there we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. The first one's from Emily Morris, who's an M3 at Emory. How do we address this inequity using urban planning and landscape architecture? How does this information inform patient education or community intervention?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, Yes. How do we use urban planning to do this? Well, I definitely think that this slide does a good job of explaining how these sorts of green infrastructure solutions can be incorporated into new and redevelopments. In that, most of the time, what we've done in many ways, new developments tend to look more like this, with nothing but impervious surfaces, and not so much an attention paid to these sorts of landscapes. So what are the sorts of urban planning things that we can do? Well, we can either incentivize or mandate minimum green spaces, along with green roofs as providing an incentive. The city of Chicago has done a very good job of incentivizing green roof utilization. You can incentivize people through pay back on their water bills if they have a stormwater management practice, like a rain barrel or a rain garden. That also tends to improve heat disparity. We can also update and preserve our understanding of tree canopy in the cities. So I know the city of Atlanta has a very healthy tree community. Trees Atlanta is one of my favorite all-time tree organizations. They are working not only to plant new trees, but to preserve the largest of the trees that exist in a neighborhood. Because you can think of a tree as a collection of beach umbrellas. The larger the tree crown, the dozens and dozens and dozens of beach umbrellas equivalent that those trees truly are. So I think urban planning can go a long way to improve the way that we build a new or redevelop a space. We can use urban planning to replace or protect the largest trees that are displaced or removed during these redevelopments, and encourage private citizens to take advantage of programs to use these same sorts of things all at the same time. Then the second part of that question was, how does this inform community? And yeah, I think by understanding that these areas tend to have higher vulnerability and in fact, even higher temperatures, this can provide information about where to go first during a heat wave, and to efficiently distribute resources in the face of an extended heat wave. You would know that these formerly redlined areas tend to be those that have the highest vulnerability, or maybe not. And that would be something, is to investigate vulnerability at a block by block level in your particular city. But then that tells us a little bit about, we can't just go there and expect to plant new trees. It's going to take a generation to plant new trees in a place and have them have significant cooling strategy. So is it, a cooling center that pops up with fans and water and air conditioning, those sorts of things. So I think it's really about this sort of information can help us more efficiently and effectively distribute resources during a crisis. So I appreciate that question. What's next, Harrison?
All right, so we have time for about one more, and I'm going to squeeze two into one here to try and maximize our bang for our buck. And if we didn't get your question, we will send it along to you afterwards. One of them is for a citation, so that'll be easily answered by email. Jumping off that, the first part of the question is if you could only implement one of those changes, because I think a lot of times it's easy to get caught up in there's so many that we want to implement, and someone asked if you could only implement one, what would it be? And then how have you turned this research into advocacy, if at all, around the Richmond community?
So the best thing, I think, from like a structural planning standpoint, is what is known as a green factor score. It's really wonky, kind of zoning code stuff. So if you want to explore Seattle, the city of Seattle has a very strong, what is known as a green factor score. That's what I would 100% advocate for. And I do advocate for that even here in Richmond. And so that's from my perspective. On the flip side of that, what has this done to create opportunities for advocacy? In Richmond, you can look up the Throwing Shade program. So that's an education experience for teens through the Groundwork RBA partnership that we have, as well as their Climate Safe Neighborhoods project. And so what they've done is to actually go out and use the maps that we generated with our partnership and through this research, And then they have engagement opportunities with members of those communities where they explain to them what the maps mean. Then they get their voice and vision back as far as what they want to see in a community project in that neighborhood. So that has yielded fruit tree plantings in school playground areas, as well as the design and implementation of shade structures for bus stops and to mitigate that exposure. And then the climate equity index for the city of Richmond was largely based on this work. So we have both the community side and we have the government side working at the same time.
Thank you so much
Wonderful.
for those questions. And thank you again, Dr. Hoffman.